Flight crew, please prepare for takeoff.
Activation code required. Scanning. Login authorized. Evacuation sequence activated. Accessing archives.
911, what is your emergency?
Suspect is armed.
Self-destruction. Planning to comply.
Officers are on the scene. In pursuit of suspect, west on Hall Road.
Synchronizing. 80%.
Take cover!
Engage. Dust to dust.
The folder looked ordinary. The kind of thing you could ignore if you like sleeping at night. But it was not paper. It was a threshold. A record of what people will do and what institutions will quietly store when they do not want to touch the fire. The modern world doesn't run on headlines. It runs on leaks, archives, sealed drawers, and favors that never make it to prime time unless somebody stumbles and spills them. On January 30th, 2026, the Department of Justice published a new batch tied to the Epstein files under the Epstein Files Transparency Act. The Department of Justice says the release includes over 3 million additional pages and that the total production is nearly 3.5 million pages, plus more than 2,000 videos and 180,000 images. These numbers are not information anymore. They're atmosphere. A storm system you don't debate. You brace for it. And in storms like this, the pattern is ancient. The powerful keep their shadows. The vulnerable get exposed. That's not a hot take. It's how fallen systems protect their center of gravity. Even coverage around congressional access has revolved around what gets seen, what stays redacted, and what remains out of reach. So I'm gonna say this clean because fuzzy language is how people get hurt. Inside a release like this, you get hard documents, disputed documents, tips that never became cases, and allegations that were filed and then archived. A document is not the same thing as proof, but a document is also not nothing. It's a footprint. And footprints mean somebody walked through that hallway. Now here's where the episode turns, because everybody asks who, like it's the only question on the table. Who knew? Who flew? Who paid? Who protected? Some of that is answerable now. But the question that makes institutions sweat is why? Why do these networks keep building the same architecture? A gatekeeper, a ladder of access, private geography, islands, jets, mansions, yachts. Space is designed to feel outside the normal world because the normal world has laws, and laws ruin the mood. And why do the most poisonous corners of this story keep attracting ritual language? Because ritual's not just candles and cloaks. Ritual is a machine for belonging and controlling. It turns behavior into identity. It turns shame into loyalty. It creates mutual silence that does not need a spoken threat, because everybody already knows what everybody did. That is why the files are not just a crime story. They are a systems story. Systems that trade reputations like currency. Systems that keep everyone smiling on camera because everyone's terrified of what lives off camera. And then there's another layer here that matters. It is not mystical, it is documentary. In September 2025, Bloomberg reported it obtained more than 18,000 emails from Epstein's personal Yahoo account, and it described how it vetted them, including cryptographic and metadata analysis. Email ain't vibe. Email is a trail. It can be spun, but it cannot be uninvented once it is in the light. Then you have the government's own shifting language about what exists and what doesn't. Running for his second term in 2024, Trump said, "I'm gonna disclose it all." Summer of 2025 comes around and he starts calling it a fabrication. July 12th, 2025, a post goes up on Truth Social. Digital ink, permanent as a confession scratched into concrete. Trump defended the officials handling the Epstein investigation and said the files were manufactured. Political theater dressed up as revelation. Just another scandal cooked in the same kitchen as the old ones. Supporters were told not to stare too long at it. Don't follow the trail. Nothing to see here. 4 days later, the tone hardened. July 16th, 2025. No more suggestion. No more soft framing. He wrote, "Their new scam is what we will forever call the Jeffrey Epstein hoax." That was the moment the narrative snapped into place. Not controversy, not investigation. A hoax. A single word that turns evidence into accusation and questions into attacks. The first clean public branding of the entire Epstein files story as political fiction. That same month, the DOJ and the FBI released a memo describing their review and concluding, among other things, that there was, quote, no client list. Narrative management is not automatically a conspiracy. It is something more common. It is how institutions survive contact with reality. Today we separate what is documented from what is asserted. We treat the loudest claims like a noise in the attic. We don't call it a ghost, but we also don't call it nothing. We check the beams. We look for prints. We ask whether the story matches the architecture of the house. We're going to talk about the ritual language in elite secrecy with discipline. Not the sloppy kind that sprints past evidence and calls it insight, but the kind that knows what initiation looks like, what binding looks like, and what secrecy is designed to accomplish. Because one of the darkest threads in this material is not a headline, it is a filing. An allegation rooted through official channels describing ritualized harm involving a child set in a place chosen for its lack of jurisdiction and then archived without becoming an investigation. That's the gray zone. The record exists, but the world looks away. And the gray zone is where systems keep their operating manuals. This is our thesis. Epstein was not just a predator. He was a librarian of leverage. A curator of compromise. And in occult vocabulary, that makes him less like a party host and more like a keeper of a grimoire. Not because demons are required, but because the logic is the same. Names, debts, seals, conditions, and control. I got the toaster plugged in. The room is dark. And somebody somewhere really hopes you will get hypnotized by the storm and forget to ask, what built this weather in the first place? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Man-Eating Toaster, brought to you, of course, by the Dancing Toaster. My name is Pastor Nelly, and today we're diving into the infamous files that are making their rounds all over social media, but we're going to be approaching them from a slightly different angle. On the main show, The Dancing Toaster, we've been talking about the history of magic, and I told you that the topic is more important now than ever. If you don't believe in the dark arts, you should be very interested that some of the most powerful people in the world do believe in them, and they are doing some of the most profane things you can imagine. Allegedly. As I mentioned in the intro, not everything in the files is verified, and I can only look at so much before feeling like I need to vomit or shower. Over 3 million pages is diabolical work. Obviously, this episode can't be exhaustive. There's too much material, and admittedly, I haven't looked at all of it because, well, I have a life, and again, I can only take so much at a time before I want to scream. Either way, the 3 million pages released represents only 2% of what actually is present. Yeah, you heard that right. We have only 2%, and that's only what they wanted us to see. Imagine what they don't want us to see. In any case, we're tying our approach today into our current series on the history of magic. We're doing a Man-Eating Toaster spin-off, the show where I cover cults and bizarre true crime, and because there are more than hints of dark ritual throughout those millions of evil pages being called the Epstein files, it fits right in. Before we begin, I want to thank you for listening. Thank you, Toasties, for supporting the work. They are the patrons over on Patreon. They help me do what I do.
You can join them and get special access to stuff, exclusives, ad-free listening, and get entered into a merch giveaway I'm doing this month. Well, people are entering this month. The drawing will take place next month to give people time to enter, but I'm doing a members-only giveaway for the Toasties, and I'm doing a social media-focused giveaway as well. Share this episode or one of your favorites on your social media and tag me to let me know you did, and you'll be entered to win that giveaway. Make sure you tag me at the Dancing Toaster so I can see it, so I know that you shouted me out. If you just want to buy some merch and support the show, head over to thedancingtoasterstore.printful.me. And if you're feeling super generous, you can head over to buymeacoffee.com/The Dancing Toaster and throw me a few bucks so I can keep the lights on, because I'm gonna go into some pretty dark places today with this episode. That being said, if you ever hear that I went down the self-checkout aisle into the morgue, they're lying to you. I'm only gonna give you one warning today. If you know anything about Epstein or those files, you know they are dark, and they talk about things that are evil and not family-friendly. I'm going to handle them as tastefully as I can, but I also don't want to over-censor certain things to where it blurs the heinousness of what he and those associated with him are doing. And yes, I said are doing. We don't know if this man is alive or dead, but don't think for a second that even if he is, that the heinous things he was involved in somehow stopped when his heart stopped, allegedly. Epstein was a clown and a pawn. His handlers live. The ones who held the strings to the puppet live, and they, no doubt, have others. This evil didn't start with Jeffrey Epstein, and it won't end with him either. Let's not bury the lead, folks. You've been warned. Turn the lights on, grab a coffee, turn the location on your phone, and let's dive in.
For the uninitiated, Jeffrey Epstein was an American financier and convicted sex offender whose case became one of the most controversial criminal scandals of the 21st century. Born in 1953 in Brooklyn, New York, he began his career in finance after briefly working as a teacher. Despite lacking a college degree, he entered elite financial circles in the late 1970s and 1980s, eventually managing wealth for extremely rich clients. Epstein cultivated relationships with politicians, business leaders, academics, royalty, and celebrities, presenting himself as a mysterious money manager with powerful connections. Much of his actual financial activity remained opaque, which later became a major point of public scrutiny. By the early 2000s, Epstein was living a lavish lifestyle supported by multiple residences, including a Manhattan mansion, a private Caribbean island, homes in Florida and New Mexico, and access to private aircraft. During this period, law enforcement in Florida began investigating allegations that Epstein had sexually abused underage girls. Police reports described a pattern in which teenage victims were recruited, paid for massages, and then pressured into sexual acts. Investigators later alleged that some victims were encouraged to recruit other minors, expanding his abuse network. In 2008, Epstein reached a controversial plea agreement with federal prosecutors in Florida. Instead of facing federal sex trafficking charges that could have resulted in life imprisonment, he pleaded guilty in state court to lesser prostitution-related offenses. He served about 13 months in a county jail with unusually permissive work release privileges. The deal drew intense criticism years later when it became public that many victims were not informed of this so-called agreement, raising questions about prosecutorial conduct and preferential treatment due to Epstein's wealth and connections. The case returned to national attention in 2019 when federal prosecutors in New York charged Epstein with sex trafficking and conspiracy involving minors dating back to the early 2000s. He was arrested at a New Jersey airport and held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan while awaiting trial. The indictment alleged a long-running system of abuse involving numerous underage victims and suggested the possibility that others may have participated or facilitated these crimes. Epstein pleaded not guilty and was awaiting trial when he allegedly died in jail on August 10, 2019. His death was ruled a suicide by the New York City Medical Examiner, though circumstances surrounding it have fueled widespread public skepticism since. After Epstein's death or disappearance, attention shifted toward his associates, financial dealings, and whether powerful individuals connected to him might face investigation. Civil lawsuits brought by victims continued, and in 2021, his longtime associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, was convicted of sex trafficking-related offenses for helping recruit and groom underage girls for Jeffrey Epstein. And that is where the mini-biography ends and the gravity begins. Because up to this point, the story still feels familiar. A rich criminal, a broken justice system, a scandal too big for one courtroom to contain. History has seen men like that before. Powerful men fall, headlines rage, trials promise closure. But Epstein was never just a man under investigation. No, he was a node. A point of convergence where money, influence, secrecy, and access overlapped in ways that made investigators uneasy and the public restless. His alleged death did not close the case, it multiplied it. Instead of answers, the world inherited fragments. Depositions sealed, names hinted at but rarely confirmed, documents referenced but not fully seen. Every revelation seemed to open another locked door behind it. The scandal stopped behaving like a normal criminal case and started resembling an archive, vast, incomplete, and strangely protected. And archives create a different kind of tension, because once the central figure disappears, the questions shift. No longer, what did he do, but who knew, who benefited, and perhaps most unsettling of all, what information still exists somewhere inside the system waiting to surface. That is the moment the story leaves the courtroom and enters bureaucracy. Investigations become paperwork, allegations become files, explosive claims stop living in headlines and start living in databases, preserved quietly under government custody. Which brings us to the next layer. Somewhere in a federal storage system under ordinary fluorescent lights, there is an extraordinary report that reads like it wandered in from a different universe. It describes an allegation so corrosive it feels fictional just to say it out loud. A former president or two, a child, a yacht drifting beyond clean jurisdiction, where borders blur and accountability thins out like cheap paint. The kind of setting you pick when you want distance. Distance from laws, from witnesses, and from consequences. What matters is not just the accusation, it is the aftertaste. The report was received, it was logged, preserved. But then it entered that strange bureaucratic coma where a document is neither validated nor dismissed. No thunderous press conferences, no public dismantling, no full pursuit. Just containment. A digital box with a case number and a timestamp. In government terms, that is a kind of a limbo. Not dead, not alive. Simply existing, but not allowed to breathe. That's the part that sticks. Institutions are built to evaluate claims, to triage noise from signal. So when something that explosive gets frozen instead of detonated or discarded, you have to ask what category it has been placed in. Too weak to chase, too sensitive to touch, or too destabilizing to risk. Silence can mean many things. Sometimes it means nothing, and sometimes, friends, it means everything. We're not here to hyperventilate. The internet does that for free every day. We are here to examine how power metabolizes information. What happens when a system receives a claim that, if true, would fracture the ceiling of the room. Why certain records are processed, labeled, and then left in the dark like volatile chemicals stored behind reinforced glass. We mentioned January 30th, the day the vault cracked. The Department of Justice released the dam, a flood of material, but only a drop of the ocean tied to a known sex trafficker named Jeffrey Epstein. Millions of pages, a torrent of images, thousands of videos. It was billed as transparency on a historic scale, but scale is not the same thing as clarity. When you dump that much data into the public square, it becomes a storm. And storms do not discriminate. They wash over victims first. Names surfaced, details surfaced. People who never asked to be symbols were suddenly searchable. Meanwhile, the powerful who should be behind steel bars remained filtered through long horizontal black bars and legal insulation. Transparency was highly selective. The exposure fell very unevenly. That imbalance tells you something about how hierarchies defend themselves, even in moments of supposed reckoning. Inside that avalanche were sections the media skimmed past, reports containing ritual language, allegations that sounded less like tabloid gossip and more like fragments of an initiation manual. Presidential names appearing in proximity to acts so extreme they strained comprehension. These were not anonymous blog posts. They were routed through official channels and stored within them. Not proven, not prosecuted, but present. The mainstream conversations orbit the who. Who was on the plane? Who attended the parties? Who sent the emails? Those are absolutely necessary questions, but they orbit the surface. We said the gravitational question is why. Why do networks of influence so often converge around secrecy and controlled environments? Why do they build private accounts and private geographies, islands, aircrafts, estates, where access is curated and behavior shifts? Why does compromise function as currency? Why does shared transgression weld loyalty tighter than shared ideology ever could? Lately, I've been digging through these files and digging through the history of magic, and what I'm finding is when you zoom out, patterns emerge that are older than any one scandal. Initiation, binding, gatekeepers. Inner circles that operate by codes understood only after you cross a threshold. You do not need mysticism to see the architecture. You need a clear view of human behavior under concentrated power. History is full of examples where elites formed enclosed systems that reinforce loyalty through secrets rather than trust. Viewed through that lens, the Epstein network stops looking like a freak anomaly that slipped through the cracks. It begins to resemble a structure. A hierarchy with degrees of access. A mechanism that rewards compliance and punishes betrayal. A place where documentation itself becomes leverage. Where the archive is not just a record of wrongdoing, but a tool of control. That is why this conversation matters, my friends. Because when a society can release mountains of information and still leave the core mechanisms intact, you are not just dealing with scandal. You are dealing with design. And design is harder to dismantle than outrage. Machines do not fear headlines. They fear exposure of their blueprint. I want to give a shout out to Esoteric Guardian for helping to frame this episode and piece some of these dark things together. Everybody called Epstein a predator. That's true, but it's only half the picture. Predators hunt. This guy archived. Earlier we mentioned Bloomberg when they obtained those 18,000 emails from his Yahoo account back in September of 2025. They were verified by 4 independent experts. Cryptographically, what emerged wasn't chaos. It was curation. He wrote to himself. He logged encounters, tagged names, noted dates, locations, moods, context. It reads less like correspondence and more like bookkeeping. The kind of obsessive indexing you see in someone building leverage, not memories. He didn't just collect moments. Epstein cataloged vulnerabilities. The unsettling part isn't just what Epstein did, it's how he kept track of it. Because archiving is not passive behavior, it is very intentional. You don't catalog thousands of interactions unless the record itself matters as much as the event, maybe even more. Those emails suggest a mind less interested in pleasure than in permanence. Every entry becomes insurance. Every name becomes weight. The archive stops being memory and starts becoming infrastructure. A private system where we set information itself functions as currency. And once you start looking at it that way, the scandal changes shape. It stops resembling chaos. It begins to look very organized. One could even say ritualized. Structured around repetition, documentation, and control. Not random access, but procedure. The kind of procedure humans have used for centuries whenever power needed to be formalized and preserved beyond a single moment. History already has a word for systems like that. Not a diary, not a scrapbook, a manual. A book designed to record relationships, obligations, and access points. A text whose value lies not in storytelling, but in activation. Something you consult when you need leverage, when you need compliance, or you need obedience. In older language, they called that kind of book a grimoire. Again, shout out to Esoteric Guardian for the framing. A grimoire at its simplest is not a spell book, but a book of instructions. But that description is too clean for what it really is. The word comes from the old French grammara, meaning grammar. Not just language, but the structure beneath language. Over time, it came to describe manuals of ritual practice, collections of names, symbols, invocations, diagrams, and procedures meant to control or interact with unseen forces. Medieval and early modern Europe produced dozens of them. The Lesser Key of Solomon, which contains the Ars Geschichte, catalogues 72 spirits along with their seals and the conditions under which they are supposedly constrained. The Picatrix blends astrology, talismanic magic, and philosophy into a technical handbook for influencing reality. These were not fairy tales. They were operational text, step-by-step systems. A grimoire does not work by enthusiasm. It works by precision. You write the correct name, you draw the correct seals, you follow the order exactly. The power in the tradition lies in documentation. If you know the name and the terms, you control the relationship. It is a ledger of authority. Even outside magic, the logic persists. A contract is a secular grimoire of sorts. A legal code is a national one. Intelligence agencies keep dossiers that function the same way. Names, activities, leverage points. Who owns what? Who can be pressured? Who can be summoned into compliance? The structure is identical. Record, index, bind. What makes a grimoire different from a diary is intention. A diary remembers. A grimoire organizes power. It does not merely describe events, it categorizes them in a way that allows retrieval and activation. Grimoires always seemed obsessed with names. An ancient thought, to know the true name of a thing was to exert authority over it. Naming establishes a boundary. It turns the unknown into something indexed. Once indexed, it can be summoned, constrained, or threatened. Or so the belief goes. In Old World language, a grimoire is a book of bindings. Not fantasy smoke and Latin incantations, but a ledger of relationships. Who is connected to what? Under what condition the obligation activates? In certain traditions, the power of the book isn't in chanting over it. It's in what it records. The fact that once something is written down, it can be summoned again. That's what those emails look like. Photographs filed like seals. Flight logs functioning like attendance sheets. Payments recorded in the same spreadsheets as gifts and favors and expenses that should never share a column. Watches to aides. Cars to lawyers. Transfers to young girls. All in one ledger. 650 emails with partner in crime Ghislaine Maxwell coordinating recruitment and damage control. It wasn't sloppy indulgence, it was system maintenance. A photograph at a cocktail party is gossip. A questionable business deal is embarrassment. But something you can never explain, never contextualize, never survive politically, well, that's binding. That is permanent. That's the kind of material that changes posture across a negotiating table. The dark question that haunts the whole structure is brutal in its simplicity. Why do Epstein and the elites he is tied to use children? Strip away the symbolism and start with divine biology. There is no deeper human reflex placed within us by our Maker than protecting the young. It isn't cultural fashion. It's wired in by our Creator, down to our hormones and our neural circuitry. You override that and you're not just breaking divine law, you're breaking a layer of yourself. Across civilizations, the most extreme rituals have always circled what is most sacred. In the Hebrew Bible, the name Molech appears in connection with children being passed through the flame. The references are few but striking, appearing in Leviticus, Kings, and Jeremiah, always surrounded by language of horror and prohibition. Yet even the ancient translators were unsure what they were reading. The Greek Septuagint sometimes treated Molech as a proper divine name, other times translated it simply as king. That uncertainty has followed the subject ever since. The Hebrew consonants MLK mean king across Semitic languages, raising a persistent question. Was Molech a specific god, a title, or something else entirely? Some scholars even suspect Israelite scribes altered the pronunciation intentionally, inserting the vowels of the word shame into the title to mock or condemn the deity. From the beginning, the ground beneath the name is unstable. The mystery deepened when French archaeologists excavating Carthage in the late 19th and early 20th centuries uncovered a precinct unlike any ordinary cemetery. The site came to be called a Tophet. Borrowing the biblical term connected with the Valley of Hinnom, layer upon layer of urns emerged from that soil. Many contained cremated remains of infants and very young children, sometimes buried alongside small animals. Stone steles stood above them bearing inscriptions invoking deities such as Baal Hamon and Tanit. The discovery ignited a debate. Some researchers saw confirmation of systematic child sacrifice. Others argued the site was a specialized burial ground for infants who died naturally in a world where child mortality was tragically common. The material evidence is undeniable. Its meaning is contested. That debate intersects directly with one of the most influential scholarly proposals about Molech itself. In 1935, Otto Eisfeld suggested that Moloch might not be a god at all, but a technical term for a particular kind of sacrifice known from Punic inscriptions using the MLK root. Under this reading, biblical phrases describing children passing through the fire would refer not to devotion to a deity named Molech, but to participation in a Molech sacrifice. The theory gained traction because of the Carthaginian discoveries. Comparative evidence from the broader ancient Near East complicates matters further. Names built on the MLK root appear across Mesopotamia and Syria associated with underworld beings, ancestral spirits, and chthonic deities tied to death itself. At Ugarit, a figure called MLK appears alongside the Rephaim, shadowy royal dead who receive offerings. This has led many scholars to suspect that Molech was connected not merely with child sacrifice, but with necromantic religion, rituals aimed at securing power or knowledge through contact with the realm of the dead. The biblical context reinforces this. Child sacrifice appears in Deuteronomy alongside divination, sorcery, mediums, and necromancers. Leviticus describes those who follow Molech as playing the harlot, language reserved for devotion to supernatural powers, to other gods. The Bible treats Molech not as a metaphor, but as a rival allegiance. Historically, the practice seems to have entered Israel from surrounding Canaanite culture and at times infiltrated Jerusalem itself. Jewish kings such as Ahaz and Manasseh participated, while King Josiah famously desecrated the Topheth in the Valley of Hinnom to end the practice. Prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel speak of parents burning their sons and daughters in fire, insisting such acts never entered the mind of God. Whether Molech was a distant deity, a sacrificial system, an underworld power connected with ancestor cults, or all of the above, the biblical writers agree on one point. Something very real was happening, something they viewed as catastrophic corruption. In the ancient Mediterranean imagination, sacrifice was measured by cost. Grain was survival, livestock was wealth. But a child represents future, lineage, continuity. To surrender that was to surrender tomorrow itself. The greater the loss, the greater the perceived spiritual potency. Sacrifice was allegiance enacted in blood. When a parent placed what divinely given instinct most fiercely protects upon an altar, the act declared that the power being invoked outranked family, survival, and even love. That is why the Tophet matters. Even if every detail of its function remains debated, the wider pattern stands. Across cultures, when humans sought ultimate power, they imagined the ultimate offering. The Hebrew Bible confronts that logic directly. Molech becomes more than a historical figure. He becomes the symbol of a worldview in which access to power required crossing a moral boundary that could never be uncrossed. Later tradition would amplify that image. Jewish interpretation, Christian theology, Islamic literature, and writers from Milton to modern novelists transformed Molech into the archetypal devourer, the horrid king besmeared with blood. Yet beneath the symbolism lies a historical struggle. Ancient people did not separate religion, politics, death, and power into neat categories. Ritual, authority, and the spirit world formed one integrated system, which explains why Scripture reacts so fiercely. The prohibitions against Molech are not abstract theology, they are boundary markers. A declaration that no power, no knowledge, and no promised blessing is worth sacrificing what God Himself declared sacred. Across civilizations, the logic repeated itself with terrifying consistency. If you want power, you sacrifice what cannot be replaced. Not grain, not animals. Your future, your bloodline, your innocence. The act does not merely destroy, it transforms, it binds. And once that line is crossed, history shows it is rarely crossed only once. And that is where the discussion stops being ancient history. Because Molech is not only a name buried in scripture or an argument between archaeologists, it represents a pattern, a recurring human intuition about power, the belief that transformation requires transgression, that access to hidden authority comes not through obedience, but through a crossing of forbidden lines. The ancient world expressed that idea through sacrifice. The altar became the place where identity was rewritten, where allegiance was proven not by words, but by irreversible action. Once the offering was made, there was no return to innocence. The participant was changed. They were marked by the act itself. That logic does not disappear when temples collapse. It merely migrates. Cultures change language, symbols, and justification, but the underlying mechanism survives. What was once framed as devotion to a god later reappears as philosophy, mysticism, ideology, or psychology, and sometimes back to a god again. The structure remains even when the theology shifts, though. Across history, movements arise that reinterpret the same principle in new vocabulary. Instead of sacrifice to a deity, the emphasis becomes liberation through boundary breaking. Instead of ritual fire, the focus turns to psychological descent. The claim repeats itself in different centuries that enlightenment, power, or awakening lies on the other side of moral inversion. Once you begin looking for that pattern, it starts appearing far beyond the ancient Mediterranean. Take Jacob Frank in the 18th century. He led a radical offshoot of Sabbatean Judaism in Eastern Europe. Frank taught that redemption did not come through stricter obedience to the law, but through its deliberate violation. He argued that divine sparks were trapped inside the material world, and that only by descending into moral darkness could those so-called sparks be released. In practice, that meant ritualized transgression. Commandments were not fences to protect you, they were barriers to be shattered. Frank called this the descent into the abyss. Not metaphorical self-improvement, a conscious inversion of sacred boundaries as a pathway to liberation. 2 centuries later, the infamous Aleister Crowley, founder of the Lemma, used similar language. He spoke of crossing the abyss, a stage in occult development where the practitioner dissolves the ego and steps beyond conventional morality. In Crowley's system, imposed moral structures were obstacles to discovering one's, quote, true will. The crossing was not about kindness or enlightenment, it was about breaking the framework that governed ordinary conscience. Other traditions, including certain extreme ascetic or left-hand path sects, have practiced deliberate taboo breaking as a spiritual technology. Now, what is the left-hand path, you may ask? Well, the term comes from Indian tantric classifications, where the right-hand path follows orthodox purity rules, while the left-hand path intentionally used forbidden acts, sometimes involving sexuality, death, or impurity, to transcend conventional consciousness. The goal was not simple rebellion. It was transformation through shock. The idea is consistent. Violate what you were taught to revere, and you will fracture your old identity. In that fracture, something new emerges. The vocabulary shifts depending on the culture. Liberation, enlightenment, power, awakening. Once you recognize that pattern, something unsettling comes into focus. Across these movements, the language changes, but the mechanisms remain the same. Religious mystics called it descent. Occultists called it crossing the abyss. Initiatory sects framed it as awakening. Each system arrived at the same conclusion from different directions. Identity can be broken and remade by forcing a person beyond a boundary they once believed sacred or untouchable. For centuries, this idea lived inside temples, secret societies, and esoteric philosophy. It belonged to the margins, hidden behind ritual language and symbolic frameworks. But the 20th century introduced a new possibility. What happens when the same principle is transferred from religious or spiritual context? What happens when transformation through boundary violation is studied not as mysticism, but as method? The sacred vocabulary disappears, the experiment remains. The altar becomes the laboratory, the initiate becomes a subject, and the ritual becomes protocol. And that shift takes us out of theology and into the modern state. For a moment, we step out of religion and into modern intelligence work, because the same pattern does not disappear when mysticism fades. During the Cold War, the CIA ran a program known as MKUltra, active from the 1950s through the early 1970s. Its goal was not spiritual enlightenment or occult initiation, but control. Researchers experimented with sensory deprivation, psychoactive drugs, psychological stress, and forms of trauma designed to fracture personality. The language was clinical rather than mystical. Personality restructuring, behavioral modification, identity destabilization. Yet beneath the sterile terminology sat a familiar assumption. Under extreme conditions, the self can be broken and reshaped. Different century, different ideology, same underlying mechanism. Push a human being across a boundary they never imagined crossing, and the crossing changes them forever. Extreme violation produces extreme alteration. That idea becomes unsettling when placed beside the life of Jeffrey Epstein. Start with the portion investigators, journalists, and even former intelligence professionals broadly agree on. Epstein behaved structurally like an intelligence cutout, even though no government will claim him. In intelligence tradecraft, a cutout is a figure who moves between powerful networks, introduces individuals who would not normally meet, gathers sensitive information through proximity, and preserves enough ambiguity to deny formal affiliation. Epstein's life fit that model unnervingly well. He cultivated relationships with presidents, royalty, billionaires, scientists, defense contractors, and figures connected to national security institutions, while the origins of his wealth remained opaque. Charlie Kirk once pointed out that Epstein's calendar revealed he met with CIA Director William Burns, Henry Kissinger, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and Obama White House counsel Catherine Rumier, who is a part of the Rothschild family, which deserves an episode all by itself. Financial investigators still cannot fully explain how he accumulated hundreds of millions of dollars while managing almost no publicly identifiable clients. Long before his arrest, that anomaly alone triggered speculation within intelligence circles. From that starting point emerged the central theory surrounding his operation, the blackmail or compromat hypothesis. Compromat, a term drawn from Soviet intelligence practice, refers to compromising material gathered for leverage. Epstein's network functioned less as a private vice operation and more as an archival system of influence. Powerful individuals were drawn into controlled environments, exposed to situations they could never publicly defend, and potentially documented. The value was not indulgence but permanence. Epstein appeared less interested in excess than in preservation, cataloging relationships and vulnerabilities with unusual care. International observers reviewing aspects of the case have described the network as resembling a global criminal enterprise operating across elite political and financial circles, precisely the kind of ecosystem intelligence services historically exploit. Then there's Epstein's closest associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, and her daddy, Robert Maxwell, individuals who maintained ties to multiple intelligence services during the Cold War, including connections within Israeli and, some say, Soviet intelligence environments. Intelligence professionals immediately recognized the familiar architecture. Recruitment and influence operations often move through trusted social networks rather than random recruitment. The Maxwell connection is one of the most blatant evidences of espionage involvement. The most widely circulated claim, and the one that will get me into the most trouble today, is the Mossad theory. This proposed that Epstein operated as an Israeli intelligence asset, running a honey trap operation targeting Western elites. Advocates of this view point to his relationships with prominent Israeli political figures, including the aforementioned former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, along with connections to individuals involved in surveillance and security ventures. At one point, an FBI informant expressed personal belief that Epstein possessed intelligence ties. Yet we're constantly told official investigations have produced no verified evidence linking him to intelligence, and of course, Israeli officials have categorically denied the allegations. But we ourselves can't confirm anything, especially with only 2% of the actual files. Other explanations push the same structure into different geopolitical directions. Some commentators have suggested connections to Russian intelligence through honey trap networks involving organized crime or recruitment pipelines from Eastern Europe, claims dismissed publicly by the Kremlin. Putin's name appears over 1,000 times in the 3.5 million pages of material, but most mentions are indirect or tangential, such as news briefings, geopolitical discussion, or third-party communications. Jeffrey Epstein repeatedly tried to arrange meetings with Putin throughout intermediaries like Norwegian diplomat Thorbjorn Jagland, but there is no evidence that Epstein and Putin ever actually met. To the contrary, this statement comes from Vladimir Putin's March 13, 2024 interview with Russian journalist Dmitry Kiselyov. Putin said, obviously in Russian,
For centuries, the so-called golden billion has been used to living off someone else's expense. They stuff their bellies with human flesh and their pockets with money. But they must understand that the vampire's bowl is coming to an end. The changes taking place in the world are irreversible. A multipolar world is being formed.
The vampire's ball is over. Interesting choice of words when the files discuss powerful Western elites consuming the blood of children. Similar speculation has circulated for years around the possibility that Jeffrey Epstein benefited from some form of U.S. intelligence protection, and much of that speculation traces back to remarks attributed to former U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta. According to reporting that later spread widely online, Acosta told members of the Trump transition team back in 2018 that Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence, and that prosecutors had been advised to leave the matter alone. Though he now denies saying it, the remark became influential because it seemed to offer an explanation for one of the most controversial prosecutorial decisions in modern American criminal justice. To understand why the statement carried such weight, it helps to walk through what actually happened in 2007 and 2008. At that time, Alexander Acosta served as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. His office inherited a federal investigation after Palm Beach police assembled an extensive case alleging that Epstein had sexually abused numerous underage girls at his Florida residence. Local investigators documented dozens and dozens of victims and gathered testimony suggesting a structured system of recruitment and exploitation. Federal prosecutors initially explored serious charges, including federal sex trafficking offenses, which could have exposed Epstein to life behind bars. But instead, Acosta approved what became known as the Non-Prosecution Agreement, often called the NPA. Under this agreement, Epstein did not face federal prosecution at all. He pleaded guilty in a Florida state court to 2 reduced prostitution-related charges involving minors. He received only an 18-month sentence and served only roughly 13 months of it in a county jail under an unusually permissive work release program that allowed him to leave custody for much of every day he was there. Even more consequential was a provision granting federal immunity not only to Epstein, but also to unnamed potential co-conspirators. That clause effectively halted a broader federal investigation before it could ever fully develop. One of the most criticized aspects of the agreement was procedural. As we mentioned before, victims were not informed that negotiations were even taking place. In 2019, a federal judge ruled that the prosecutors violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act by failing to notify them before finalizing the dirty deal. The ruling did not undo the agreement, but it reinforced the perception that the process had bypassed all normal safeguards. The backlash was bipartisan and unusually intense. Critics argued that the deal appeared extraordinarily lenient compared with the scale of allegations gathered by the investigators. Former prosecutors, journalists, and victims' attorneys contended that the agreement shielded Epstein from any meaningful accountability and prematurely closed off investigative avenues that might have exposed additional participants or clients. Acosta consistently defended his decision. He maintained that the case presented evidentiary risks, that a guaranteed state conviction ensured at least some punishment, and that prosecutors feared Epstein's powerful legal team might defeat federal charges altogether. In his telling, the agreement represented a pragmatic compromise rather than partiality. However, when Epstein was arrested again in New York back in 2019 on those federal sex trafficking charges, scrutiny over the earlier plea deal intensified dramatically. Questions resurfaced about why a case involving numerous minors and extensive documentation resulted in such a limited outcome. The renewed controversy ultimately led to Acosta's resignation as Secretary of Labor during Donald Trump's first administration. This is the point where the intelligence speculation enters the story, because the outcome of the 2008 case seems so atypical. Observers searched for explanations beyond ordinary prosecutorial discretion. The alleged remark that Epstein might have had intelligence connections provided a narrative framework for many people trying to understand how a wealthy defendant obtained an agreement that insulated both himself and unnamed associates from federal exposure. All that to say, folks, Acosta approved a plea agreement widely described as a sweetheart deal. That agreement limited Epstein's punishment, and it delayed broader federal accountability for more than a decade. What is most frustrating is that we still only have circumstantial evidence showing intelligence agencies played any role in this joke of an outcome. The Acosta episode became a focal point not simply because of what was said, but because it illuminated a larger question that still unsettles observers: whether Epstein's extraordinary social connections translated into extraordinary institutional protection. To many, such as myself, the answer is obvious. What we can prove is Epstein's extraordinary ability to cultivate relationships within multiple government institutions. Investigations reveal that he formed unusually friendly connections with certain officials, including personnel within U.S. Customs and Border Protection, receiving smoother travel treatments after offering gifts and social access. This behavior closely mirrors influence cultivation common in intelligence practices, where informal cooperation emerges through access, favors, and personal relationships rather than formal recruitment. Epstein did not need to belong to an intelligence agency to operate according to intelligence logic. He appeared to understand how power, discretion, and bureaucratic loyalty functioned. Epstein represents an anomaly. His wealth was unexplained. His 2008 plea deal resulted in unusually lenient treatment. His social reach crossed political factions and national boundaries. He documented relationships obsessively and survived scandal after scandal that would have destroyed ordinary figures. His operation reflected the logic of intelligence agencies because he probably was tied to more than just one. Information often carries far greater value than money. Leverage outweighs ideology. Compromise created stronger bonds than loyalty ever could. If compromising records exist, hierarchy becomes an invisible system of restraint.
That is where the earlier discussion of boundary crossing returns with force. Apply the MK Ultra principle to individuals whose authority depends entirely on public legitimacy. Presidents, princes, billionaires. Their power rests on reputation, on stability, and on perceived moral standing. If one of them crosses a line society universally condemns, and that crossing is documented, the consequence extends beyond legal risk. It becomes psychological capture. They are no longer merely embarrassed. They are bound. Trauma researchers often say the body keeps score. The nervous system encodes experiences even when the conscious mind constructs narratives to survive them. Participation in something that cannot be confessed, defended, or explained becomes a permanent internal fracture. Documentation transforms that private fracture into external control. The knowledge exists in two places at once, inside the person and inside the archive. That is why the deepest taboo becomes the strongest adhesive. Once crossed, it does not simply fade. It settles into memory and identity. If another party holds the record of that crossing, the relationship ceases to be symbolic. It becomes structural. Whether understood in theological language, psychological language, or intelligence language, the mechanism remains the same. The archive becomes power. The honest conclusion is uncomfortable in its simplicity. Epstein undeniably cultivated global political and financial elites, and his activities resembled known blackmail tradecraft. Speculation about intelligence involvement began early and has never disappeared. Yet we cannot prove it was CIA, Mossad, Russian intelligence, MI5, MI6, or any other agency, or all of them. What remains is a figure whose behavior mirrors that of an intelligence intermediary without definitive proof of who he served. Though many are currently suggesting that the way he spoke of Gentiles or non-Jewish people in his correspondence reveals who held the strings. There is a predictable objection that always appears at this point in the conversation. Surely intelligence agencies would never cross certain lines. Surely there are limits. Surely children would be off the table, right? History answers that assumption with uncomfortable clarity. The Cold War produced a worldview in which psychological warfare was believed to determine whether entire civilizations survived. Inside that atmosphere of existential fear, ethical boundaries did not simply blur. In several cases, they collapsed. The CIA launched a series of covert behavioral research programs beginning in the early 1950s, the most notorious being, of course, Project MK Ultra. Publicly, the objective was defensive, understand interrogation, resistance, memory manipulation, and whether hostile governments could engineer controllable human behavior. What later investigations uncovered was far darker. Experiments were conducted through universities, hospitals, and research foundations secretly funded by intelligence channels. Many subjects never knew they were even participating. Among those exposed were psychiatric patients, young adults, and in some documented cases, minors and institutionalized youth who were considered convenient research populations rather than protected individuals. One of the clearest examples emerged from the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, where psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron carried out experiments financed indirectly by CIA funds. Cameron attempted what he called psychic driving, an effort to erase existing personality structures and rebuild them from scratch. Patients who had entered treatment for relatively ordinary problems such as anxiety or depression were subjected to massive drug regimens, prolonged induced sleep, extreme electroconvulsive therapy, and endless loops of recorded messages played while they were heavily sedated. Some participants were young enough to fall into legally vulnerable categories. Many later emerged with permanent memory loss, cognitive impairment, or profound psychological trauma. These were not fringe rumors or conspiracy theories. The abuses were exposed through congressional investigations, particularly the hearings of the Church Committee in the 1970s, which revealed that informed consent had frequently been ignored or bypassed entirely. The pattern extended beyond one institute. Researchers funded through covert grants explored hypnosis, behavioral conditioning, and drug-induced compliance. Intelligence planners feared adversaries might create programmable agents,
so they attempted to map the limits of psychological fracture themselves. Some studies examined interrogation resistance among military dependents and young institutional populations. Documentation remains incomplete because in 1973, the then CIA director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MK-Ultra records. What survives today consists largely of financial traces, testimony, and scattered archival remnants. The gaps in the archive explain why speculation continues, but even the confirmed record demonstrates a willingness to experiment on vulnerable people under the justification of national security necessity. What else might they be willing to do for power, for national security, for the so-called greater good? Of course, none of this proves modern intelligence agencies run trafficking networks or ritual conspiracies. What is historically established, though, is that intelligence institutions operating under secrecy and fear have exposed young and defenseless individuals to harmful experimentation in the pursuit of power and strategic advantage. The lesson is not sensational. It is real. It is sobering. Secrecy combined with perceived existential threat can convince otherwise rational institutions that extreme actions are justified. And that realization brings the discussion back to Epstein. The question is not whether intelligence agencies are morally incapable of exploiting vulnerability. History shows they are capable of crossing boundaries when they believe the stakes demand it. The real question becomes structural rather than conspiratorial. When an individual builds an archive of leverage, cultivates access across governments, and operates inside systems built on secrecy, influence, and compromise, he begins to resemble mechanisms that intelligence history already recognizes. The archive becomes power, and power seeks environments where accountability is weakest. The past does not need exaggeration to feel unsettling, folks. The verified record already tells us that institutions, like individuals, can rationalize almost anything when control, survival, or advantage appear to hang in the balance. And now we shift back. Because once you accept that institutions have historically crossed lines they publicly claimed were unthinkable, the question changes. The debate stops being about whether powerful systems could exploit vulnerability. History already settled that. The question becomes why certain patterns repeat whenever power concentrates behind closed doors. When secrecy protects reputation, leverage becomes currency. When leverage becomes currency, behavior stops being accidental. Networks begin selecting for information that binds rather than information that frees. Influence no longer depends on loyalty or ideology, it depends on shared exposure, shared risk, shared silence. Seen from that angle, Epstein's world stops looking like chaos driven by appetite alone. It begins to resemble structure. Access, documentation, discretion, and proximity to power form a recognizable architecture. The same logic intelligence services discovered during the Cold War are the same psychological mechanisms exploited long before modern governments ever existed. Human hierarchies repeatedly learn the same lesson. Ordinary secrets fade. Minor scandals will pass, but certain boundaries once crossed create permanence. A person who carries an unconfessable memory carries a tether. The archive does not need to threaten openly. Its existence is enough. When you view the network through that lens, the emphasis on youth stops looking random and starts looking disturbingly functional. As we said, the deeper the transgression, the stronger the hold, the more absolute the violation, the more permanent the leverage. That does not prove every allegation. It does not sanctify every rumor. It does not require belief in ancient gods lurking behind modern boardrooms. It does something more unsettling. It shows that across thousands of years, human hierarchies have repeatedly discovered the same brutal equation. The destruction of what is most sacred produces a bond that is the hardest to break. Call it ritual, call it blackmail, call it psychological restructuring, call it whatever you want. The names may differ, the dark architecture remains, and once you recognize that architecture, you begin to notice something else. Power almost never walks in the room naked. It arrives in robe, in ritual. Across civilizations, authority has wrapped itself in symbol, in ceremony and ritual, not merely for aesthetics, but for transformation. Symbols are not decorative language. They are tools. They reshape perception, alter emotional states, and signal entry into a different order of reality. Ritual creates a boundary between the ordinary world and a controlled sacred space where participants understand that different rules apply. Ancient rulers understood this instinctively. Egyptian pharaohs staged divine processions to embody godhood. Roman elites centered mystery cult initiations that promised hidden knowledge unavailable to the masses. Medieval courts fused governance with liturgy so completely that political authority and sacred authority became indistinguishable. The pageantry was never accidental. Ritual did not accompany power. Ritual generated power. Occult traditions preserve this understanding openly. Ceremony marks transition. Masks dissolve individual identity into collective identity. Repetition induces psychological and sometimes spiritual alignment among participants. Whether interpreted psychologically, spiritually, or theologically, ritual functions as an engine of cohesion. It binds participants through shared experience that cannot be fully explained to outsiders. Secrecy amplifies the effect. When influence operates behind closed doors, environment becomes an active participant. Location is chosen with intention. Architecture frames meaning. Atmosphere prepares the mind. A place removed from ordinary life signals that participants have crossed into a liminal zone, a threshold space where hierarchy, loyalty, and identity are renegotiated. Which brings us to a place hiding in plain sight. A retreat that publicly calls itself theatrical while drawing unapologetically from ancient symbolic language. A gathering where modern political and financial authority meets ritual imagery older than empires. Beneath redwoods that rise like pillars of a forgotten temple. Northern California. Redwoods tall enough to make a cathedral jealous. Every summer, a private club called Bohemian Grove closes the gates and lets in presidents, CEOs, cabinet members, and media executives. The club has existed since the late 19th century. Officially, it's a retreat. Campfires, skits, networking under trees older than the Constitution. But at the center of the property stands a 40-foot concrete owl. They call the opening ceremony the cremation of care. Robed figures gather before that owl. A recorded voice booms through the trees, and an effigy representing care is burned on a small lake. The stated meaning is simple. Leave your worries behind. Suspend your conscience for a week. No business deals, no burdens, just fraternity. But symbols don't exist in a vacuum, folks. We know owls carry history. We've talked about it before, though it's been a while. In ancient Mesopotamia, night birds were associated with liminal figures. One famous artifact, often called the Burney Relief, or the Queen of the Night, dates to roughly 1800 BC. It depicts a winged female figure standing on lions and flanked by owls. Scholars debate her identity. Some connect her to Ishtar, others to Ereshkigal, but in later Jewish mystical traditions, that imagery was folded into the figure of Lilith, erroneously portrayed in medieval Kabbalistic text as Adam's rebellious first wife, a notion we crushed way back in episode 4 of The Dancing Toaster. In any case, Lilith becomes a symbol of the untamed, the nocturnal, the force that operates outside the ordered garden. The owl in that frame is a creature of the dark. It sees what daylight misses. It hunts when the village sleeps. We shift to Greece. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, carries the owl as her emblem. Not chaos, but calculation. The ability to see clearly in low light, to move without being seen. The owl becomes shorthand for intelligence operating in shadow. Sound familiar? So when powerful men gather before a monumental owl and ceremonially burn care, the imagery layers itself whether you acknowledge it or not. The ritual says we are stepping outside ordinary restraint. We are suspending the part of ourselves that hesitates. We are entering a space where we can speak and think without the burden of consequence. Now we go back through the corridor of time and space to Carthage, where archaeology uncovered the Tophet, that precinct containing thousands of urns with cremated remains of infants dedicated to demonic gods. The theme is clear in the ancient imagination, rulers offering what costs the most to secure power and favor with the other side. Initiatory systems, whether religious, political, fraternal, or clandestine, have operated the same way for hundreds of years. They rarely throw someone straight into the deep end. They move in stages. The first stage is access. You're invited in. You attend meetings. You observe rituals. Nothing irreversible happens. The experience feels symbolic, even theatrical. The purpose is psychological. It creates a sense of belonging. You are no longer outside the circle. The second stage introduces cost. Not catastrophic cost, but enough to mark you. You share information that is not public. You participate in something that would be embarrassing if exposed. You adopt a language and customs that separate you from the ordinary world. This is where identity begins to shift. You now have something to lose. We've seen things like this before when we dove into Scientology. It's of course the secret reason behind all the auditing. There we also learned of L. Ron Hubbard's ties to the occult and even Aleister Crowley. While you're emptying your heart of burdens, they are filling their ledgers with leverage, just like Epstein. The third stage is binding. Here the acts are not symbolic. They are consequential. You cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. It may be illegal, immoral, or simply reputationally catastrophic. At that point, loyalty is no longer based on shared ideals. It is based on shared vulnerability. Everyone in the room knows something about everyone else. Historically, you can see versions of this structure in cults, medieval guilds, intelligence services, organized crime, and even modern fraternities. The details may differ, but the architecture remains. Outer circle, inner circle, core, symbol, cost, bond. The reason this progression exists is simple. Trust is expensive. The deeper the secrets, the stronger the adhesive must be. Ideology can unite people for a time. Shared risk unites them more tightly. Shared guilt unites them permanently. So when people talk about initiation, it's more than candles and cloaks. They are describing a process. Gradual inclusion, gradual exposure, gradual escalation. Each step marks the next step possible. By the time someone reaches the innermost tier, the earlier stages feel harmless by comparison, and that contrast is part of the design. A man who attends Bohemian Grove and watches the effigy burn has crossed a threshold. He has participated in a controlled ritual space. He has tasted belonging. Nothing irreversible, not yet, but he has stepped into an environment where symbolism carries weight and hierarchy is reinforced. In any tightly bonded hierarchy, the inner circle is separated not just by privilege, but by exposure, by what they know, by what they have done, by what could destroy them if revealed. When discussions turn toward darker allegations, toward networks that allegedly involved exploitation and documentation, the concern is not theatrical symbolism. It is the possibility of escalation. If a system is built on shared transgression, each degree must carry more gravity than the last. The outer degree is theater. The inner degree is dark leverage. That is the fear people articulate when they speak of Molech. He has nothing to do with owls, by the way, historically, and we're not speaking of bronze idols with outstretched arms, but the archetype of power purchased at the ultimate cost. The exchange of innocence for advantage, the surrender of what is most sacred for operational freedom. Whether that archetype is metaphor or reality in any specific case requires evidence, not mood, but the pattern we see is ancient. Elite ritual, progressive initiation, increasingly binding acts. The deeper you go, the fewer can follow. And the ones who remain are tied together by what they cross to get there. In the end, the owl in the redwoods may be nothing more than theater, but it is also a reminder of something older. Power loves ceremony. It loves darkness. It loves spaces where the daylight rules are temporarily suspended. What happens inside those spaces determines whether they remain pageantry or become something else entirely. Let's slow down and try and keep our footing as we go back to a previously mentioned event, but one only alluded to. In 2020, an anonymous tip was filed with the FBI describing alleged events that are said to have occurred around the year 2000. The setting, according to the filing, was a yacht in international waters. That detail is not insignificant. International waters are a legal gray zone. No single nation's jurisdiction fully applies. It is the kind of space lawyers notice and novelists love. A floating liminal zone. Not land, not fully lawless, not fully governed either. The tip named powerful figures. First and foremost, Jeffrey Epstein. With him, former President Bill Clinton. Someone who went to Epstein's demonic island dozens of times, as seen in flight logs, and now plenty of pretty pictures. There's also a reference to another former president who also just so happened to be a director of the CIA, George H.W. Bush. The allegations describe the sexual violation and ritualized harm of a child. Other parts describe demonic acts against infants, dismemberment, and consumption of certain elements that I feel disgusting just talking about. The content is graphic and disturbing. The document exists. It was filed. It was archived. It was not publicly investigated. FBI procedure distinguishes between dismissal and archiving. A dismissed tip is considered without merit. Archived means something else. It means the information is retained, preserved but not pursued. That is a bureaucratic middle state. Neither validated nor rejected, simply suspended. Now here is where we need discipline. The allegations remain unverified. Anonymous source, no publicly released corroborating physical evidence. What stands out is not only the claim itself, but the way the claim is framed. The wording in the report follows a narrative architecture that shows up again and again in the study of ancient religion and myth. Anyone who has spent time with comparative mythology recognizes the pattern almost immediately. We laid it out, and across civilizations these symbolic sequences repeat. One of them is the surrender of what is most sacred. In the ancient Near East, including the biblical condemnations of child sacrifice associated with Moloch, in books like Leviticus and 2 Kings, the rhetoric always circles around cost. The offering that hurts the most is imagined to carry the most weight. Sacrificing an animal costs something. Sacrificing a harvest costs something. But sacrificing a child represents the collapse of future, of humanity, of lineage, protection, hope. It is the reversal of the deepest human instinct, which is to guard the young and the vulnerable. That inversion becomes the dark symbol of total allegiance. Another recurring element is division or dismemberment. Move from culture to culture and the pattern refuses to die. Again and again, ancient stories began with something unified, powerful, even divine, and that unity is torn apart. The violence is not random, it is productive. The fracture makes the world. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the storm god Marduk defeats the primordial sea goddess Tiamat. He does not merely overcome her, he splits her body. One half becomes the heavens, the other becomes the earth. The cosmos is not spoken into existence gently, it is carved from the remains of a defeated chaos, order built from a divided body. In Norse mythology, the giant Ymir is slain by Odin and his brothers. His flesh forms the land, his blood becomes the seas, his bones rise as mountains. His skull arches overhead as the sky, his brains become the clouds. The universe is assembled from a corpse. Creation is reorganization after dismemberment. Chinese mythology tells of Pangu, the giant who grows within the cosmic egg that contains undifferentiated reality. When he dies, his body transforms into the features of the world. Breath becomes wind. Voice becomes thunder. Eyes become the sun and moon. Limbs become mountain ranges. Unity dissolves into distributed existence. In Mesoamerican tradition, the Aztec goddess Coilchalqui is dismembered by her brother Huitzilopochtli. Her broken form becomes the part of the cosmic narrative of order overcoming chaos. The great carved stone of her fragmented body was placed at the base of the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan. The myth was not abstract, it was architectural. Sacred space was grounded in the image of a shattered body. The Greek world offers its own versions. In Orphic myth, the infant Dionysus is torn apart by the Titans. They consume him. Zeus annihilates the Titans, and from their ashes humanity is born. Human beings inherited both the violence of the Titans and the divinity of Dionysus. The tearing explains the divided human condition. Egyptian tradition recounts how Osiris is murdered by Set, cut into pieces, and scattered. His fragments become woven into the land itself. Out of his dismemberment come resurrection and kingship. Political legitimacy and cosmic stability grow from a broken god. The Vedic hymn of Purusha describes a primordial being sacrificed and divided. From his mouth comes priests, from his arms warriors, from his thighs merchants, from his feet laborers. The moon arises from his mind, the sun from his eye. Society and cosmos alike are explained as the partitioning of a once unified life. In Jewish mystical thought, particularly in the Kabbalistic concept of Shevarat HaChalim, the shattering of the vessels, divine light is poured into primordial containers that cannot contain it. The vessels break. Sparks of divine light scatter into the material world. Human history becomes a project of gathering and repairing what was fractured. Human history becomes a labor of gathering and repair. Even philosophical myth participates in this pattern. In Plato's Symposium, Aristophanes tells of humans once whole and spherical, split in half by Zeus. Ever since they seek their missing other, the fracture explains longing. Alchemical symbolism echoes the same rhythm: dissolve and recombine, break down the prima materia before it can be transformed. Disassembly precedes elevation. Across continents and centuries, the structure repeats. The institution is consistent. Creation and destruction are intertwined. Differentiation requires fracture. Once the whole is divided, there is no returning to the original state. A new order stands in its place. In these stories, power is redistributed through breaking. The broken body becomes land or law, identity or cosmic structure. The myth tells us what was once one has become many, and that the many still carry the memory of the one. It is a strange and persistent image. The world as aftermath, the present as the consequence of a primordial terror. And history is either the management of that fragmentation or the hope that someday, somehow, the pieces might be gathered again. Different cultures, different languages, the same structural image. Symbolically, dismemberment in these myths does not function as random cruelty. It represents irreversible transformation. This imagery also encodes a concept of power. Power is not only held intact, it can be released, transmitted, or diffused through rupture. When the body of the god is scattered, sacred force spreads. When the vessel shatters, divine light permeates the world. So when ancient narratives describe tearing, scattering, or dividing a sacred being, they are not merely recounting violence, they are offering a cosmology. They are explaining how unity becomes plurality, how order emerges from rupture, and how destruction can paradoxically generate a new distribution of meaning and power. There is one piece in the sequence that shows up again and again in ritual systems. That is incorporation. In many traditions, ritual does not end with sacrifice. It ends with ingestion. What has been offered is not only destroyed, it is taken in. It is internalized, made part of the participant. Ancient Greek religion carried this logic. In the Eleusinian mysteries, initiate strength Akekion, a sacred beverage tied to the myth of Demeter and Persephone. We do not know every detail of the rite, but ancient testimony suggests that drinking marked entry into the sacred drama. You did not stand outside the myth, you stepped inside it. In Dionysian rites, wine itself represented the god Dionysus. To drink was to participate in the god's presence. The divine was no longer external. It moved inward. Even amongst ancient Israel, we have examples. In temple sacrifices, not every offering was completely burned. Portions were given to the priests, portions were given to the worshiper. The meal sealed covenant. The act created relationship. The offering became shared substance. Even in Christianity, the Eucharist is described as participation in the body and blood of Christ. The language is intentionally physical. The believer does not simply remember redemption. The believer partakes in it. The symbol becomes embodied. Roman religion followed a similar pattern. Public sacrifices were followed by communal feasts. The sacrifice was killed in sacred context, and the community ate together. The meal reinforced civic identity. It was not incidental. It was the mechanism of incorporation into shared order. In several African traditional religions, offerings to ancestors are followed by ritual meals. The living and the dead are symbolically linked through shared food. The boundary between worlds is bridged through ingestion. Among certain indigenous North American tribes, consuming part of a hunted animal was tied to absorbing its strength or spirit. Respect for the animal and incorporation of its life force were intertwined. The act was not only sustenance, it was participation in power. In Aztec ritual life, beyond the well-known heart sacrifices, there were structured communal meals in which portions of the sacrificial victim were distributed. These acts were framed as covenantal participation in sacred force. The logic was not random brutality, it was incorporation. Even outside explicitly religious systems, the pattern remains. Blood brother rituals mingle blood to symbolize shared life. Warriors drinking from a common vessel after battle seal loyalty. Graduation ceremonies, weddings, political summits all end with meals. When humans formalize belonging, they eat together. The reason is simple and profound. Eating is the most intimate metaphor for internalization. What you consume becomes you. You are what you eat takes on a new meaning, doesn't it? It enters your body, it fuels your cells. There is no clearer image for making the external part of the self. Anthropologists describe this as ritual incorporation. It signals three core realities. First, participation. You are no longer mere spectator. You are implicated. Second is covenant. Shared substance creates shared obligation. Third, transformation. A boundary has been crossed. What was outside now resides within. This is why sacrifice and meals so often appear together. Destruction alone does not complete the ritual circuit. Incorporation does. It communicates that a line has been crossed collectively and that its consequences now live inside the participants. It is one of the most enduring structures in human religious and social life. Across continents and centuries, cultures return to the same insight. If you want to bind people together, make them share in what has been offered. When you step back, a recognizable structure emerges across cultures. Something precious is offered. It is broken or destroyed. Then it is incorporated. Cost, rupture, internalization. This sequence forms a kind of ritual grammar. It dramatizes ultimate allegiance. It dramatizes ultimate transgression. It says we have crossed a line together, and now we carry it within us. The narrative in the FBI tip follows that structural arc. An offering framed as innocence, an act of violent rupture, an element of incorporation. And even the setting at sea, international waters, outside ordinary jurisdiction, heightens the sense of liminality. Water in many traditions marks transition. Baptism, crossing the sea, leaving land. It symbolizes passage from one state to another. A yacht in international waters is legally ambiguous and symbolically between worlds. Recognizing this structure does not confirm the events described, but it does show that the story is constructed from well-established symbolic materials, and those materials are ancient. They have been used for millennia to narrate power, transformation, and taboo. From here, the possibilities narrow but do not resolve. One possibility is that the informant believed the events were real and described them using language that naturally follows mythic templates. Human beings often reach for symbolic frameworks when describing what feels absolute or unspeakable. Another possibility is that the account was crafted deliberately, drawing on sophisticated knowledge of comparative religion and esoteric symbolism that would require more than casual familiarity with pop culture references. It would imply a level of symbolic literacy that is uncommon. If the events occurred, the implications are obvious and they are severe. If the account was constructed, it was constructed carefully. In either case, the structure is not accidental. I wish I could say this report was a one-off occurrence in those files. Sadly, it is not. An iMessage conversation mentioned in the files between Epstein and filmmaker Woody Allen discusses cannibalism. Defenders try to write it off as dark humor, but Woody Allen is a creep and one of Hollywood's best-kept secrets. Not only do we know he visited Epstein's New York residence on multiple occasions, he also allegedly groomed his girlfriend's adopted 10-year-old daughter, who is now his wife. In the 1970s, Mia Farrow adopted a young South Korean girl named Soon-Yi. Allen entered her life when he was 44 years old, and she was 9 or 10 as he started dating her mother in 1979. They were together all the way until 1992 when Mia broke things off. You see, in January of 92, Mia went to the apartment of the 55-year-old Allen and found explicit Polaroid photographs of her adopted daughter, Soon-Yi. Yeah, she may have been 21 years old at the time, but the photos made it clear that they were now engaged in a sexual relationship. Her adopted daughter in a sexual relationship with her boyfriend, 34 years her senior, whom she met when she was 9. That moment, I believe, revealed his grooming behavior and promptly ended Allen and Farrow's long partnership and has become one of the most buried scandals in Hollywood history. And if you're wondering how close Allen and Epstein were, Epstein helped arrange a 2015 White House visit for Allen and Soon-Yi during the Obama administration, demonstrating that Epstein was actively using his political access on Allen's behalf and that Obama opened the door for him. All of this taking place long after Epstein's 2008 conviction. Allen and Obama are just another two major powerful figures who opened the door for a monster. And that is where the story stops being about isolated personalities and starts becoming again about structure. Because when the same names appear over and over, when scandal follows proximity rather than ideology, when access continues even after conviction, you begin to notice something deeper than coincidence. Individual controversies start to look less like disconnected moral failures and more like visible fragments of an underlying system. The symbolic pattern we just traced, offering, rupture, incorporation, does not exist only in myth or accusation. It mirrors how power networks actually stabilize themselves. Shared secrecy binds more tightly than shared belief. Influence survives not through loyalty but through mutual exposure. Once multiple powerful figures remain connected to the same hub long after warning signs emerge, the question naturally shifts. Not who attended which dinner, not who visited which house, but how the environment itself functioned, because environments can be engineered. What appears socially casual on the surface can operate structurally underneath. Invitations, introductions, favors, travel arrangements, private meetings. Each interaction feels ordinary in isolation, but taken together, they begin to resemble infrastructure. And when infrastructure appears, hierarchy follows. What we are looking at is not merely a circle of wealthy acquaintances orbiting a controversial financier. The pattern suggests something organized, layered, and adaptive. A system where access expands outward while vulnerability concentrates inward. Which brings us to the architecture surrounding Epstein himself. The structures surrounding Epstein did not operate like a loose social circle. It functioned like a hierarchy. Access moved in layers. Influence flowed downward while vulnerability flowed upward. Billionaires, politicians, academics, scientists, celebrities, financiers, young recruits. Different social classes, same gravitational pull. Everyone occupied a position somewhere inside the system. Every complex power structure develops an intermediary, a figure who stands between the visible world and the hidden mechanism beneath it. Someone who makes the abnormal feel ordinary. Someone who smooths the transition so that no single moment feels like crossing a moral line. In the Epstein network, that role was unmistakably filled by Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of Mossad asset Robert Maxwell. Historically, these gatekeepers appear again and again. Maxwell belongs to a reoccurring historical archetype, the intermediary of transgression, the broker who stands between elite power and forbidden practice. Every era produces some version of this figure, different costumes, same social function. We can start in ancient Rome. During the late Republic and early Empire, aristocrats participated in private mystery cults that promised secret knowledge, protection, and divine favor. The Bacchanalian scandal of 186 BC is one of the clearest examples. Roman authorities uncovered networks of initiators who introduced senators, nobles, and wealthy citizens into nocturnal rites dedicated to Bacchus. According to Livy's account, the panic was not only about religion, but about control. Initiators acted as social translators. They reassured participants, managed secrecy, and normalized behavior that violated Roman moral expectations. The Senate eventually outlawed the gatherings because hidden networks operating outside public oversight frightened the state more than theology did. Move forward to Renaissance Italy. Julia Tofana, operating in the 17th century, ran what appeared to be a cosmetics business. In reality, she supplied aristocratic women with a poison known as aqua tofana. Her operation depended on intermediaries who introduced clients discreetly. The poison was disguised as holy water or devotional oil. The gatekeeper did not present crime as crime. She framed it as liberation, protection, even spiritual necessity. Elite clients could cross a moral boundary gradually, almost ceremonially, without feeling they had made a sudden descent. Same century, now France, the affair of the poisons, Catherine Deschays, known as La Voisin, arranged introductions between aristocrats and forbidden rituals, translating elite curiosity into dark participation. Shortly after La Voisin, the affair of the poisons revealed an entire ecosystem of facilitators. Fortune tellers, midwives, alchemists, priests willing to conduct black masses, and social brokers connecting them to nobility. Madame de Montespan, mistress of Louis XIV, allegedly sought magical assistance through these intermediaries to secure royal favor. Whether every accusation was true remains debated, but the structure is undeniable. Elite anxiety created demand. Gatekeepers supplied access. Now jump to the 19th century Europe. Occult revival movements such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn relied heavily on initiators who curated access to esoteric knowledge. Figures like Samuel Liddell, MacGregor Mathers, and Aleister Crowley later performed a similar social role. They introduced politicians, writers, aristocrats, and intellectuals into ritual systems framed as philosophical or spiritual advancement. Again, the intermediary made the crossing feel intellectual rather than transgressive. Early 20th century intelligence culture produced its own versions. Sidney Riley, sometimes called the Ace of Spies, operated less as a traditional agent and more as a connector among financiers, industrialists, politicians, and intelligence services. He moved elites into covert arrangements they might have never entered directly. His value was not ideology. It was access management. Even organized crime shows this pattern. Maxwell and Epstein were not the first figures compared to a procurer or facilitator. In mafia history, individuals known as fixers or introducers arranged meetings between legitimate businessmen and criminal networks. Meyer Lansky famously functioned this way for financial elites, translating underworld operations into respectable investment opportunities. Participants rarely felt they had crossed into crime at the moment of entry. The transition was gradual. The pattern extends into cult movements. Charles Manson himself was not initially the gatekeeper. Women like Mary Brunner and later recruiters normalized entry into the group for outsiders. NXIVM used high-ranking female recruiters who framed escalating commitments as self-improvement. Keith Rayner's authority depended on intermediaries who softened the psychological threshold. Across all these examples, the structure repeats. A powerful class grows curious or desperate. A forbidden or risky practice exists outside public norms. An intermediary appears. The intermediary reframes participation as safe, exclusive, enlightened, even necessary. The boundary is crossed quietly. Maxwell embodies a social mechanism rather than a historical anomaly. Civilizations change technologies, religions, and politics. What does not change is the human tendency to outsource moral risk to someone who makes the unacceptable feel ordinary. The gatekeeper does not create desire. The gatekeeper organizes it. And once organized, private curiosity can become a system. Maxwell operated in that intermediary space. She was socially fluent, aristocratic, and disarming. Victim testimony and court findings described her as the person who recruited, reassured, scheduled, and framed Epstein's environment as safe and sophisticated rather than predatory. She walked worlds, elite society on one side, vulnerable young women on the other. In 2021, she was convicted of federal sex trafficking charges and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Still a joke. The conviction established legally what investigators had long suspected, that Epstein's operation relied on coordination, not chaos. The documentary record reinforces how central she was. Released correspondence shows hundreds of communications between Maxwell and Epstein, including more than 200 messages exchanged in just the first half of 2008, even as legal pressure mounted around him. Communication did not slow during crisis, it intensified. That pattern resembles management rather than companionship. The physical locations tied to Epstein also formed their own architecture of access. Each property served a different social function, almost like concentric circles moving inward. The Manhattan townhouse, originally connected to retail magnate Les Wexner, operated as a recruitment and networking hub. It was public enough to feel legitimate, filled with art, academics, and philanthropic conversations. Guests could enter without immediately perceiving the danger. Palm Beach became the operational core. Police investigations, forensic evidence, and victim testimony confirmed repeated abuse occurring there. This was no longer introductory space. It was where the structure revealed its true purpose. The New Mexico ranch remains one of the least understood nodes. Sparse documentation and limited investigative access leave large gaps in the public record, which only adds to its mystique. What is known suggests it functioned as a secluded environment removed from scrutiny, attractive precisely because distance creates silence. The Paris apartment extended the network internationally, reinforcing Epstein's identity as a global broker moving effortlessly across national boundaries. And then there was Little St. James, the infamous island with what looks like a demonic temple at its center. The location has come to symbolize the entire operation. Remote, privately owned and controlled, reachable only through invitation, and transportation controlled by Epstein himself. In symbolic terms, it represented the innermost circle, the place where isolation removed witnesses and social consequences felt suspended. Seen together, the properties resemble stages of initiation rather than random real estate holdings. Each step deeper required greater trust, greater secrecy, greater compromise. Movement through the network was gradual. No single movement announced itself as irreversible, yet each step narrowed the path back out. Systems built on leverage rarely rely on overt coercion. They rely on escalation. Participation accumulates, secrets compound. Eventually, the participant realizes something unsettling. The exit was never designed to be easy. By the time one reaches the metaphorical temple on the cliff, the architecture has already done its work. The door does not need to be locked loudly. It only needs to close quietly behind you. Up to this point, we have been looking at structure, gatekeepers, initiation, gradual escalation. A system that moves people inward one step at a time until participation itself becomes the binding agent. But systems only become visible when you follow the people moving through them. Architecture explains how something operates. names reveal who passed through the doors. Because once the intermediary has done their work, once the environment has normalized secrecy, once access has been granted and compromise accumulated, the mechanism leaves behind something unavoidable. A record. Not a confession, not a single smoking gun. Something more persistent. Patterns. The history of these networks shows that exposure rarely arrives as one decisive revelation. It emerges as fragments scattered over time. Photographs here, flight manifests there, emails, introductions, invitations, and denials. Each piece insignificant alone, together they begin to outline the shape of influence, the properties, the gatekeeper, the graduated access. All of it leads to the same endpoint, an archive of association. And when investigators, journalists, and analysts began examining what survived Epstein's collapse, they did not find a clean narrative. They found repetition, the same rhythm appearing around different figures, proximity followed by distance, familiarity followed by public disavowal, contact acknowledged, then minimized, evidence existing just short of final certainty. The structure fades into the background, the names come forward. As we said before, Bill Clinton appears frequently across flight records, photographs, and witness testimony, frequently placing him within Epstein's social orbit during the late 1990s and early 2000s. Clinton has consistently denied any wrongdoing and has said he severed ties before Epstein's criminal exposure. During a deposition connected to civil litigation, he invoked the Fifth Amendment multiple times, the legal right that protects against self-incrimination, but inevitably fuels public suspicion. The important structural detail is not guilt or innocence, it is exposure. In networks built on leverage, the mere existence of association becomes currency regardless of what actually occurred. Draft communications attributed to figures such as Bill Gates circulated in investigative materials and online commentary, including references to sensitive personal situations involving foreign nationals. Many of these drafts lack authentication, signatures, or verified origin. Intelligence analysts often note that unverified documents can still function as tools of influence. In compromat logic, a document does not need to be provably true to exert pressure. It only needs to be plausible enough to create risk. But volume often feels like evidence in and of itself, not to mention a woman scorned. An ex-wife who cryptically keeps speaking of a coming time of retribution. A similar pattern appears with Elon Musk. Musk has publicly stated he declined invitations connected to Epstein and never visited the island, though certain messages say otherwise. Yet older communications reported by journalists show Epstein attempting to cultivate contact discussing social gatherings and elite events. Connection, refusal, residual, association. The contradiction itself becomes the story. Reputation operates in shades, not absolutes. Campaign manager and White House strategist to Trump, Steve Bannon, maintained friendly communication with Epstein long after his 2008 conviction, including documented meetings and collaboration discussions tied to a proposed documentary project. Reports describe gifts exchanged and extensive recorded interviews. Witnesses interviewed by investigators sometimes express reluctance to speak openly, citing Bannon's political influence and powerful relationships. Again, the pattern emerges. Access creates hesitation long before legal conclusions are reached. Howard Lutnick, our current Secretary of Commerce, acknowledged limited contact with Epstein. But we know he went to the island, and certain documents referenced by journalists describe deeper professional overlap, including planned meetings and business interactions. And on a personal note, I absolutely hate when this man bursts into laughter when the president is receiving questions concerning Epstein. Even if Lutnick didn't do anything nefarious when he was on Epstein's island, these files don't reveal anything remotely funny. So I have to repent when I want to punch him in his teeth. Across the Atlantic, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, became one of the most publicly scrutinized figures connected to Jeffrey Epstein. His association with Epstein had already triggered years of controversy, culminating in a civil lawsuit filed by Virginia Giuffre alleging sexual abuse when she was a minor. In 2022, Andrew reached a financial settlement with Giuffre without admitting wrongdoing. a move that avoided a civil trial that would have opened extensive discovery, including flight records, financial documentation, witness testimony, and sworn questioning under oath. Money saved the pervert's butt, but only for a little while. The situation changed dramatically following his recent arrest, which transformed what had long existed as reputational scandal into an active criminal matter. Authorities moved beyond civil litigation into formal legal proceedings, signaling that investigative pressure surrounding Epstein's network had not fully dissipated after Epstein's alleged death. The arrest revived questions that the earlier settlement had effectively frozen in place, particularly regarding what evidence might emerge under criminal scrutiny rather than civil negotiation. Where the settlement once functioned as a legal endpoint, the arrest reopened the historical record. Civil resolution had limited disclosure. Criminal process now carries the potential for compelled testimony, evidentiary examination, and institutional accountability extending beyond a single defendant. This is one of the most important things to come from the files so far. We may not be taking them seriously enough in America, but other parts of the world certainly are. And that means there is weight to the information in these files, and we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. We've already discussed a pivotal institutional moment centering on Alexander Acosta. As U.S. Attorney in Florida, Acosta approved Epstein's 2008 non-prosecution agreement, that sick sweetheart deal that was widely and rightly criticized as unusually lenient. During later political vetting, Acosta reportedly suggested he had been told Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence. That phrase has echoed through time, though he's tried to deny it. Acosta resigned as labor secretary in July 2019, shortly after Epstein's federal rearrest reignited scrutiny of the earlier deal that his fingerprints were all over. That rearrest marked a rupture in the protective pattern. On July 6, 2019, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York determined the Florida agreement did not shield Epstein from new charges. He was arrested on federal sex trafficking allegations involving victims as young as 14. Bail was denied. Epstein was held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. 35 days later, he was allegedly found dead. Whether viewed through legal history, intelligence speculation, or institutional failure, the same question persists. How did one individual maintain access to presidents, princes, billionaires, financiers, scientists, and political strategists across ideological lines while repeatedly escaping lasting consequence until the final moment? No confirmed evidence proves Epstein operated as an intelligence asset, yet the structure surrounding him mirrors systems long recognized both in espionage and in occult tradition. Systems where knowledge becomes currency, secrecy becomes initiation, and compromise becomes binding. Intelligence agencies understand one version of this logic. Information outweighs money, leverage outweighs ideology. A secret held in common creates stronger cohesion than loyalty ever could, but older ritual systems describe the same mechanism in different language. Not tradecraft, but binding. Not dossiers, but grimoires. A written record that transforms relationship into obligation, into control. Across many esoteric traditions, power is not imagined as raw force. It is mediated through hidden knowledge, shared transgression, and controlled access. Initiation requires crossing a threshold. Once crossed, the participant belongs to the system, not only socially, but psychologically. The secret becomes internalized. Silence becomes participation. The archive functions like a book of names, a ledger where inclusion itself carries consequences. Protection in such a structure does not require a centralized conspiracy directing every action. It can arise organically from mutual exposure. When influential individuals share vulnerability, accountability diffuses naturally. Each participant has incentive to preserve stability because destabilization threatens everyone simultaneously. The system sustains itself through reciprocal risk rather than command. In occult language, this resembles a pact sustained not by ritual chanting, but by shared knowledge that cannot safely be spoken aloud. In intelligence language, it resembles deterrence through compromat. Different vocabularies describing the same architecture. Secrecy generates gravity. Participation generates allegiance. The archive therefore becomes more than evidence. It becomes presence. Even after the central operator disappears, the structure persists because the record persists. Names remain connected. Memories remain encoded. Questions remain unanswered. And unanswered questions exert a peculiar kind of power. Like an unfinished ritual or an unopened file, they continue to pull attention, suspicion, and fear toward the empty space where certainty should be. Whoever controls the remaining documents controls the narrative that surrounds every name still hidden inside of them. Power over information has always been power over memory, reputation, and history itself. The struggle is not only about what happened, but about who decides when the veil is lifted and how much light is allowed through. Hermetic philosophy offers an old metaphor for this process. At the Temple of Sighs stood the inscription associated with Isis. I am all that has been, that is, and that will be. No mortal has lifted my veil. The veil represents hidden reality, truth concealed not because it does not exist, but because exposure must be mediated. Christians are familiar with the Greek word apocalypsis, from which we get apocalypse. It did not mean destruction. It meant unveiling, revelation, the removal of covering. What we are witnessing with the Epstein disclosures resembles less a sudden exposure and more a controlled apocalypse. An unveiling released in stages, but one that may be about controlled destruction as well. And who knows what these monsters intend to build in place of the old system as they seemingly burn it down. My eschatology shapes some of what I think they will do next, but for now only time will tell, and we're running out of time today. Mystery schools operated this way for millennia. The outer mysteries were public and accessible. Anyone could attend festivals, hear stories, or learn symbolic teachings. The middle mysteries required effort and initiation. The inner mysteries remained sealed, known only to a narrow circle whose authority depended on secrecy. The structure of modern document releases often follows a similar architecture. The outer layers appear transparent. Celebrity names, photographs, partial logs, enough material to dominate headlines and create the impression of disclosure. The middle layer invites speculation. Allegations of intelligence ties, ritual language, disturbing associations. Enough ambiguity to provoke investigation while preserving plausible deniability. Then the inner layer remains sealed. Millions and millions of pages still restricted, still classified, accessible only to institutional authorities. Many of them foxes guarding the henhouse. Transparency exists, but it is tiered. Public statements themselves reveal this tension. Officials at different moments suggested explosive revelations were imminent, only for later reviews to claim no definitive client list existed. Victim stories became public while many powerful figures remained legally insulated and covered behind those infamous black bars. The process resembled revelation without resolution, disclosure that illuminated suffering while leaving structural accountability incomplete. Kabbalistic tradition warned that direct exposure to the infinite, to Ein Sof, the unmediated totality of truth, overwhelms rather than enlightens. In mythic language, the veil exists partly as protection. Sudden total revelation destabilizes systems built on managed perception. Some think modern institutional disclosure often behaves similarly. Information emerges slowly, filtered through legal process and language, political negotiation, and narrative framing. History shows that concealment systems rarely remain permanent. Ancient grimoires were burned, yet copies survived in monasteries. Royal decrees sealed scandals only for historians centuries later to reopen archives. The affair of the poisons disappeared beneath royal censorship until forgotten testimony resurfaced. MK Ultra files were ordered destroyed, yet surviving financial records exposed the dark program decades later through congressional investigation and freedom of information requests. Every system designed to hide knowledge eventually develops fractures. The independent acquisition of large private email archives distributed to Epstein represented such a fracture. Messages believed private entered public analysis outside official disclosure channels. Authentication by independent experts gave them evidentiary weight, separate from government narrative control. Throughout history, decisive revelations often emerge not from official transparency, but from material that escapes their containment. Jesus said in Luke 8:17, "For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest, nor is anything secret that will not be known and come to light." Movements once believed erased have repeatedly resurfaced through documentation. Sealed testimonies reopen when the institutions and individuals that sealed them lose power. Concealment depends on continuity. Time itself erodes control. But ultimately, God Himself will remove the veil. All that is done in secret will be made known, will come to light. The enduring question for now is not whether additional truth will emerge, but what kind of institutions will exist when it does. What will fall apart? What will we be left with? And for how long? Disclosure changes systems unevenly. Sometimes it reforms them. Sometimes it merely transfers secrecy into new hands. Certain facts are firmly established. Epstein operated a trafficking network that exploited numerous underage victims over many, many years. He was convicted, later rearrested on federal charges, and maintained extraordinary access to political, financial, and cultural elites across ideological lines and across global boundaries. His archives contained extensive documentation of relationships and communications. These elements are historical record. Other claims remain allegation rather than verified conclusion, at least for now. Yet one broader pattern persists across the centuries of human organization. Power accumulates information. Information accumulates leverage. Systems built on leverage tend toward secrecy. Whether described through political science, intelligence history, sociology, or religious or esoteric symbolism, the mechanism appears repeatedly. Hierarchical networks form inner circles protected by controlled access to knowledge. The most uncomfortable question is therefore structural. Are such systems rare aberrations created by uniquely immoral individuals, or recurring features that emerge whenever power concentrates without oversight? History provides examples across civilizations suggesting that secrecy and hierarchy naturally generate hidden layers of operation. The interpretation of those layers varies depending on worldview, but the recurrence itself is difficult to ignore or deny. What remains unresolved are the sealed pages, the unreleased materials, the unknown decisions made behind institutional doors. Archives change form across eras. Parchment becomes paper, paper becomes encrypted servers. The medium evolves while the fundamental struggle over knowledge and power continues. Understanding the pattern does not require certainty about every claim. It requires careful attention to evidence, skepticism toward both denial and exaggeration, and willingness to examine primary sources directly. The pursuit of truth is rarely dramatic unveiling all at once. More often, it is incremental illumination, page by page, document by document, PDF by PDF, as the veil lifts slowly enough for society to confront the horror that lies beneath. If any part of you still feels as though this could be nothing more than conspiracy theory, you're ignoring what's actually going on. Prince Andrew is hopefully the first of many to be removed or locked up for the evil things he has been a part of, allegedly. And it's not just him. Since the release of those more than 3 million pages of material connected to Epstein, a cascade of institutional fallout has occurred across politics, finance, academia, diplomacy, and cultural leadership. Unlike Prince Andrew, many of these individuals affected are yet to be charged with any crimes. Instead, reputational exposure became the decisive force. In a system where credibility functions as currency, proximity alone proved enough to end careers. In the corporate and legal world, several prominent figures stepped aside as scrutiny intensified. Thomas Pritzker retired from his role as executive chairman of Hyatt Hotels Corporation and departed California's Civic Partnerships Commission after renewed attention to historical connections appearing within released correspondence networks. Catherine Rumler, Chief Legal Officer, General Counsel of Goldman Sachs and a former Obama White House counsel, announced her resignation effective June 30th following disclosures of extensive communication with Epstein, including emails that drew intense public criticism. Brad Karp, resigned as chairman of the influential law firm Paul, Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison, describing his relationship with Epstein as an unacceptable distraction to the firm's work. Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem stepped down as chairman and CEO of global port giant DP World as international scrutiny expanded beyond Western political circles. Media and entertainment are not immune. Casey Wasserman announced plans to sell the Wasserman Talent Agency after correspondence with Ghislaine Maxwell surfaced in the document review process. Financial and intellectual institutions experienced parallel consequences. Former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, whose early communications with Epstein had already generated controversy, withdrew further from public life, stepping away from academic and advisory roles following renewed attention from the document release cycle. Physician and public health commentator Dr. Peter Attia resigned from leadership roles connected to corporate and media partnerships after his communications in the Epstein files became public. Joanna Rubinstein stepped down as chair of Sweden for UNHCR and amid similar reputational pressures. These departures illustrated how modern influence networks extend far beyond politics into philanthropy, academia, and public expertise. Political and diplomatic institutions saw some of the most visible fallout. Peter Mandelson, serving as the United Kingdom's ambassador to the U.S., was also just removed from the diplomatic post before later resigning from both the Labour Party and the House of Lords. The repercussions ripple outward. Morgan McSweeney resigned as Chief of Staff to British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, accepting responsibility for advising Mandelson's appointment. Slovak diplomat Miroslav Lajčák stepped down as national security advisor to his country's prime minister following publication of communications tied to Epstein's network. Norwegian diplomat Mona Juul resigned as ambassador to Jordan and Iraq, while veteran French political figure Jack Lang left his leadership position at the Arab World Institute in Paris. Swedish politician Isabel Lövin stepped down from leadership within the Greens EFA parliamentary group as scrutiny spread through European political institutions. Cultural and academic spaces were affected as well. David A. Ross resigned as department chair of the School of Visual Arts in New York after renewed examination of social and professional ties revealed in the files. The pattern across academia mirrored what occurred in finance and diplomacy. Institutions moved quickly once public association became reputational liability, regardless of legal finding. Beyond the names already listed, ongoing reporting and document analysis continue to draw renewed attention to other high-profile figures whose relationships with Epstein had previously been documented. Former President Bill Clinton remains among the most frequently referenced individuals in archival materials, though he has denied wrongdoing. Technology and finance circles revisited historical interactions involving figures such as Bill Gates and Elon Musk, both of whom publicly denied participation in wrongdoing while acknowledging varying degrees of contact. Political strategist Steve Bannon, former Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta, and several international financiers also re-entered public discussion as investigators and journalists re-examined past relationships in light of newly available documentation. What unified these departures was not criminal conviction, but structural exposure. The documents revealed the extent to which Epstein's social orbit intersected with elite institutions across continents. Influence networks that once appeared fragmented suddenly looked interconnected when viewed through a single archival lens. The resulting resignations demonstrated how reputational systems operate under modern transparency pressures. Association alone, once publicly visible, could become professionally unsustainable. The broader significance of the fallout lies in how disclosure functions within power structures. Large archives do not merely reveal individual actions, they map relationships. When millions of pages enter public scrutiny simultaneously, they transform scattered connections into an intelligible network. Institutions respond defensively, removing figures whose continued presence threatens legitimacy. The Epstein disclosures therefore produce less a moment of closure than an ongoing recalibration of elite accountability. Careers have ended. Reputations have shifted. Institutions attempted to distance themselves from a network whose full implications remain under examination. And my friends, I hope we're just getting started. But that is where we have to stop. Not because the story is finished, far from it. So much more could be said. The archive remains open. The names remain contested. The questions remain louder than the answers. Throughout this episode, we trace documents, institutions, ritual language, intelligence patterns, ancient symbolism, and modern power structures. We walked from Carthage to Cold War laboratories, from mystery cults to courtrooms, and from grimoires to government servers. And what emerges is not a single conspiracy tied neatly with a bow. What emerges are patterns. Human beings have always discovered the same dangerous truths. Power without accountability begins to hide itself. And once it hides itself, it begins to protect itself. Not always through coordinated evil, often through shared silence. The scandal of Epstein is not only that a demonic predator existed. History has always produced predators. The scandal is that systems surrounded him and covered up his nefarious deeds. Doors opened after warnings. Invitations continued after conviction. Access survived exposure. That tells us something uncomfortable about how modern society functions. Evil rarely announces itself as evil. It arrives dressed as prestige, Satan disguised as an angel of light. Comes as philanthropy, as network, as opportunity. And by the time people realize what environment they entered, the architecture has already done its work. But here's the part that matters most. This episode has not been an invitation to paranoia. It has been an invitation to clarity. Because Christians of all people should not be shocked by hidden corruption. Scripture never promised that rulers would be righteous. It warned repeatedly that darkness gathers where power concentrates without fear of God. Ephesians says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers, principalities, and rulers of darkness in this present age. Those dark rulers are very real. And they're the same ones that have been plaguing us from the Old Testament. Epstein, who was responsible for the abuse and death of God knows how many kids, had a bank account named Baal. Epstein and the people he's connected to, they know of Yahweh, and they are rebelling against him in some of the darkest ways you could possibly imagine. The Bible describes a world where sin organizes itself, where injustice builds systems, where people trade truth for protection and silence for survival. And yet Scripture also insists on something else. Nothing hidden stays hidden forever. Empires bury records, governments classify files, institutions manage narratives, but history keeps leaking because truth has gravity, and eventually gravity wins. But greater than that, again, Luke 8:17, Jesus says, nothing that is hidden will not be made manifest. That's not conspiracy language, that is theological certainty, friends. One day, every archive and every file will open. Every secret will surface. Every victim will finally be seen. Every account will be settled. Not by journalists, not by governments, not by internet detectives or corny podcasters. By Christ himself, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The danger in stories like Epstein is that they tempt us to despair or rage. I have felt both the last few weeks. They make it feel like darkness is winning, like corruption is too entrenched to confront. But Christianity has always stood on a scandal even greater than this one. The worst injustice in history was carried out publicly, legally, institutionally, and religiously when Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, God the Son, was executed by cooperating political and spiritual authorities who were protecting their own power and interests even then. But 3 days later, the system that killed him discovered something terrifying. They couldn't kill the truth. Truth lives, truth resurrects. That is the hope, folks. Not that every document will be released tomorrow. Not that every powerful person will face earthly justice. History tells us many never do. The hope is that no evil escapes final judgment. This is why, unlike some in Christendom, I am glad the doctrine of hell exists. Though many will escape justice on this side, they will not escape it there. No victim disappears into paperwork. No hidden thing remains hidden forever.
So what do we do with all of this? We refuse naivete. We refuse hysteria. We must refuse apathy. We pursue truth carefully. We protect the vulnerable fiercely. We refuse to worship power simply because it wears a suit instead of a crown. And most importantly, we examine our own hearts. Because the line between corruption and righteousness does not run between elites and ordinary people. It runs through every human soul. The same hunger for control, secrecy, and self-preservation that builds corrupt systems begins small inside individuals. The fight against darkness is not only external, it is spiritual. The Epstein files may expose the sickness of institutions. The gospel exposes the sickness of humanity, a sickness present in every human heart, not just Jeffrey's. And unlike hidden archives, the curse is not sealed. The cross is not secret society, the resurrection is not classified information, and the invitation to redemption is public. For whosoever believes will have eternal life. Light has already entered the world, friends, and darkness, no matter how organized, never survives it forever. My friends, please like and share this episode. Please tell somebody about it. That's the only way people are going to find out about these things and find out about my little show, my little corner of the internet, where I have a tiny little bullhorn screaming into the void about all the insanity that is unfolding behind closed doors. If you do share it, make sure to tag me this month, again, February 2026. I'd like to give away some merch. If you want to help me to continue to do deep dives like this one, join the Toasties on Patreon and help me keep the lights on. I need a little bit of light right now. Links for everything, as always, are in the show notes. I want to thank you all for listening today to the Man-Eating Toaster and the Dancing Toaster. Wherever you're listening, again, like, share, subscribe, comment, leave a review, follow, do all the things. Wherever you consume the Man-Eating Toaster, but whatever you do, don't consume toasters, and don't let any evil financiers consume you. I love you. I'm out.
Flight crew, please prepare for takeoff.
Activation code required. Scanning. Login authorized. Evacuation sequence activated. Accessing archives.
911, what is your emergency?
Suspect is armed.
Self-destruction.